people remember the 30s, they remember a New Zealand of extremes, the kind of extremes we like to dissociate from New Zealand ever since. They remember the poverty, and they might use the word class when they speak of it. The unemployment, which began in 1926, extended into the 30s, and there were many who did not know where the next meal was coming from. Poverty brought unhappiness. There was a lot of misery in the 30s. But there was fun, too, and the poor had their share of it. They were the good old days. You'll hear people say, we made our own fun in those days, singing ourselves hoarse around the piano. We're able to forget the hard times, except now and then when the chill wind of recession brings back a whiff of those confused years. In 1930, with the war to end all wars 11 years behind us, we were just beginning to think of ourselves as New Zealanders, to think as New Zealanders. And we'd already developed some national characteristics. It was a paradox of the time that in a country beset by poverty, there were always plenty with a bob to put on a horse, even their last bob. Was it for the thrill, race by race, or the hope of a quick quid, or was it an escape bid? Was there something desperate about it? At all events, the horses and the fashions meant money spent and happiness bought. The newly appointed Governor-General, Lord Bledisloe, soon became a familiar and much respected figure at meets and shows. If you were rich and wanted to escape, you could get away from it all quite literally in the Picton ferry Tamahine, dancing across to Picton and the Sounds for the weekend, with picnics, swimming, excursions ashore, the lot. The lot for $10. New cars were anything from $200 for a baby Austin. Mind you, not too many people had cars. And petrol was 19 cents a gallon. So people clubbed together to share the cost and traveled the quick-step, the waltz and the velita, and every now and then arrived back home just in time to change for work. And the same things were happening all around the world, a universal search for fun. No one outside Hawke's Bay dreamt that anything was wrong. Until on the morning of the 3rd of February 1931, just before 11, the first earthquake report came from the Navy sloop Veronica. Napier and Hastings flattened. $240 dead. $4,000 injured in just 2 minutes. The cruisers Dunedin and Diomede arrived soon after, and the Navy took charge, helping, seeking, probing for the dead and injured lying buried in the crumpled buildings. An emergency hospital was set up. The more critically injured were shipped out, and the homeless cared for under canvas. People were shocked by the force of the Napier earthquake, but the whole country was bewildered and stunned by the heartless severity of the depression. Of course, we didn't have it to ourselves. In fact, we in New Zealand were better off than a lot of industrialized countries. But that was cold comfort for those who lost everything. Economically, New Zealand's position was unstable. A weak reform government was being given half-hearted support by impatient Labour members while they waited for promised reforms. Important public works were abandoned because of the costs involved. Long after other countries had legislation to deal with unemployment, New Zealand still had made no provision. Because Prime Minister George Forbes believed in the principle of no work, no pay. So the unemployed were put to demoralizing cheap work. Draining swamps, quarrying rocks, making golf courses. Forbes was a plain, honest man, but not very original. And an uncompromisingly severe financial policy didn't add to his popularity. So that the men who planted the Kaingaroa forest, who could at least believe in what they were doing, were housed under canvas in conditions which were at best primitive. Men on the dole were bitter men, and no wonder. It was common to see engineers, architects, teachers, lawyers, carpenters, wielding shovels and pushing barrows in the back blocks. Children stealing food. Ex-servicemen begging. Queues at soup kitchens. By September 1931, the country had reached such a low ebb that the United Party and the Reform Party formed a coalition to combat the vociferous Labour Party. Their unity was their strength, especially since there was discord between the Parliamentary Labour Party and the militant trade unions. The coalition was elected to power, but Labour did win 24 seats. The new government felt it had to balance the budget. A budget which cut civil service salaries by 10%, cut pensions, cut the education bill by raising the school beginners age from 5 to 6 and lowering the leaving age, and closing 2 training colleges, cut still further into public works, thereby creating fresh unemployment. Riots followed in Auckland and Wellington. The farmers were producing more, receiving less, and they faced the same old mortgage commitments. In just 3 years, the national income was almost halved. Belatedly, the government introduced numerous grants, subsidies, mortgage relief acts. From May 1933, the future looked brighter in New Zealand and everywhere else. The post office showed that savings deposits exceeded withdrawals, a sure sign of improving conditions wherever you find it. But for Prime Minister Forbes and Minister of Finance and Unemployment Gordon Coates, it was too late. Gordon Coates, a man of great political courage, was soon to be reviled and detested by the unemployed for not doing enough, and abhorred by the extreme conservatives for doing too much. Unemployment forced the militant trade unions to come to terms with the party they'd previously scorned, the opposition Labour Party. Leader of the opposition, Michael Joseph Savage, a benign political uncle with remarkable charm. His simplicity was no pose. He really would have been equally at home in a small cottage with a few pounds a week. It was impossible to denounce him as an ogre, and his political foes knew it. In fact, Forbes, during the 35 election campaign, reproved a Labour opponent by telling him, "That's not cricket. Joe Savage wouldn't say that." Public acceptance of Savage and Labour was not unlike the worship that Seddon and the Liberals had received at the turn of the century, and Labour used the ghost of Seddon to improve their image. "We intend to begin where Richard John Seddon left off," said Savage, and the result of the 1935 election, a landslide victory for Labour, with 53 of the 80 seats. Prime Minister Michael Joseph Savage. His cabinet was entirely new to the business of administration, but what they lacked in experience, they made up in enthusiasm. Walter Nash, Minister of Finance. Peter Fraser, parliamentary tactician and Minister of Health and Education. Irrepressible Bob Semple, Minister of Works, with a flavour all his own, the man who called Hitler a snivelling snufflebuster. These were the men, that first December in power, who sent government departments into near panic with instructions to make double payments to relief workers, increase pensions, put back the 10%, all before Christmas. But even with an economy on the mend, there were still people out of work, a lot still on relief. So to speed up complete recovery, labour placement centres were set up. H.E. Armstrong was Minister of Labour.
How do you do, gentlemen?
How do you do, sir?
Well, gentlemen, I've just been looking over the latest placement returns, and it does seem to me that the result is very encouraging. It has developed into one of the most important branches of the department. I think we should consider the advisability or otherwise of making it a permanent department, because it seems that the necessity for the department will be there, whether there is an unemployment problem or not. Now, in addition to finding avenues of employment for those who are unfortunately unemployed, the investigations that take place in regard to the suitability of the applicants for the work that is offering is very necessary and desirable, because in that way we avoid the mistakes of the past, where they've been endeavouring to place square pegs into round holes.
1936 was quite a year. The future seemed rosy. It was a new experience for New Zealand to feel closer to the rest of the world. And for 5 bob down and 5 bob a week for 2 years, you could have the world on your mantelpiece. And people who didn't own a radio visited people who did. They listened to the news on the radio, they sang songs with the radio, and they followed a wonderful new fashion of the 30s in New Zealand, professional wrestling. It really caught on, week after week, town halls filled with fans screaming for blood. A great number of overseas wrestlers came to supply it, and of course, then as now, there were the goodies and the baddies. If you were in doubt how to classify a man, his name usually gave a clue. Kara Pasha, the terrible Turk with his Boston crab. Abe Coleman, who stood 5'6" and weighed 14.5 stone and used his weight for butting. Tom Alley with the crucifix hold. Jumping Joe Savoldi. And of course, the two best known, both of them goodies, New Zealander Lofty Blomfield with the octopus clamp, and Earl Macready, whirling bodies ba-dump round the ring with the rocking chair splits. There were dozens who came, including the first of the gimmicky wrestlers back in the early 30s. Whiskers Blake and Count Varga were as well known as any of them. Cinema was another fashion, and cinema brought the fashions. Never before had New Zealand women been so familiar with what the rest of the world was wearing.
An orange suit in fine woven wool with short divided skirt, suitable for tennis and beach wear, and showing the new shoulder cape. A one-piece cotton beach pajamas in floral design, low sunback and full flared trousers. Here we have a beige crinkly crepe ensemble. 3/4 semi-fitting coat introduces the new wide shoulder line. Another charming white crinkle organdy frock with plain organdy pleated shoulder frills to match the pleated frill around the skirt. Organdy, of course, is a big feature this season in floral, check and plain colors. Billowy effects, fluffy and fascinating. This is a charming beige satin gown with brown velvet sash.
Cinema was shrinking the world as radio had done, and now these two were joined by aviation. Kingsford Smith, what that name conjures up. He first flew the Tasman in 1928, a feat that the pundits said was impossible. And after landing the Southern Cross, the old bus, at Wigram, Smithy went barnstorming up and down the country, giving joyrides at 10 bob for 10 minutes to pay for his pioneering petrol. New Zealand's own Jean Batten, the first woman to fly solo from Australia to England, 1934, and in November 1936, from England to New Zealand. Great excitement, she crossed the Tasman in a record 9.5 hours. And Jean Batten wasn't the only one. The Berlin Olympics, 1936.
Bacali in the dark vest on the inside goes ahead. Corns of Great Britain passes him to make the running. Now, Becher of Germany comes into third place. Corns holds his lead. Becher comes up on the straight, passes Bacali, now Corns. So into the straight for the second time, Cunningham, Schomburg, Lovelock, Bacali, Corns. Now, the fair-haired Nye of Sweden comes up on the outside. 2 laps to go. Nye runs into second place. Into the straight again. Nye and Cunningham fighting it out. Lovelock third. Now the last lap. There comes Lovelock, running like a train. Nice shot his boat. Bacali's third. Record.
First, Lovelock, New Zealand. Second, Cunningham, America. Third, Bacali, Italy.
In May 1937, we had a new king. The Duke of York succeeded his uncrowned brother, and his coronation with Queen Elizabeth saw a gathering of kings, queens, princes, and princesses who would never meet in such a ceremony again. George VI, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas, King, Defender of the Faith, Emperor of India. King George was crowned in the English spring, and in the New Zealand spring a few months later, we watched our own less colourful but vitally important pageantry. New Zealand had always been a farming country. And as to the farmer and his A&P shows, most of us looked to gauge our new-begun prosperity. High-stepping strudder or riding hack provided the answer to the transport problem. It was the Clydesdales and Shires, the heavy draft horses, that captured the scene. They were the equivalent of present-day D8s. With improving overseas market and government-guaranteed prices for farm products, the farmers started spending, and the country was on the move again. Everywhere, people looked to the future with more confidence. There were guaranteed wages, social security, for most a 40-hour week. And of course, there was also compulsory unionism. Now, with the hard times behind, there was an urge to expand, to find trade with countries other than Britain, though of course she remained the traditional market. There was also an urge to diversify the economy and to encourage manufacturers to set up new industry. To help it become established, the government imposed a scientific selection of imports, which was just another name for protection of the local product. Expansion became the keynote, agriculturally and industrially. New Zealand designers and engineers worked overtime to catch up on the backlog of public works. The age of machinery has arrived, said Bob Semple, and in his usual flamboyant manner, bulldozed a wheelbarrow into the past. Semple was quick off the mark with his public works projects and made it known he expected a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. His knowledge of construction work and his ability to call a spade a picturesque spade made him popular with his men, and more than a little proud when he drove the last rivet into the Hawke viaduct ahead of schedule and declared it open. If ever the result of the coming 1938 election seemed in doubt, Mick Savage dispelled it by reminding the country of his administration's achievement.
It is less than 3 years ago since New Zealand's first Labour government was given a mandate to carry out a program of economic and social progress. That policy was put forward as a means of lifting New Zealand from the depression which had strangled New Zealand industrial life and broke the hearts of thousands of its best citizens during the 5 years ending in 1935. Our mission is to build and not to destroy the social structure. And for that, we will have to expend the whole of the elements that enter into the everyday life of the people, including health, education, and general security.
General security. In the past, we relied on our isolation and Britain's might for protection. But with Japan's invasion of China and her obvious policy of expansion, our position was less than secure. The regular army comprised 578, supported by 10,000 territorials. The New Zealand division of the Royal Navy had 2 cruisers, Achilles and Leander, manned almost entirely by Royal Navy personnel. The Royal New Zealand Air Force had 756 regulars and 404 territorials, equipped with mostly obsolete aircraft. Its main function was to supply pilots to the RAF. Such was our military power, and it had not been much increased when we declared war on Germany in September 1939. As the country mobilized, a great exhibition to mark the end of our first century opened in Wellington. Viscount Galway had succeeded Lord Bledisloe as Governor-General in 1935. So it was towards the end of his term of office that men were seen less and less in civvies, more and more in uniform. New Zealand was in battle, but the celebration of the centennial continued. It would be the last national celebration for a long time. And while enjoying the fun and wonder of it all, people remembered a message broadcast by the now ailing Prime Minister about this war, which had begun with the closing of one decade and would continue for half the next.
I am satisfied that nowhere will the issue be more clearly understood than in New Zealand, where for almost a century, behind the sure shield of Britain, we have enjoyed and cherished freedom and self-government, both with gratitude for the past and with confidence in the future. We range ourselves without fear beside Britain. Where she goes, we go. Where she stands, we stand. We are only a small and young nation, but we are one and all a band of brothers. And we march forward with a union of hearts and wills to a common destiny.